The betrayal they met during freshman orientation at Northwestern University. Two 18-year-olds from small towns who found comfort in each other's company amid the overwhelming chaos of college life. Michael Chen was quiet and studious, the kind of person who always had his assignments completed days before they were due. Sarah Williams was his opposite in many ways, outgoing, spontaneous, with a laugh that could fill an entire room. But somehow, their friendship just worked. Michael had grown up in a family where academic achievement was everything. His parents, both engineers, had sacrificed enormously to give him opportunities they'd never had. The pressure to succeed was constant, suffocating, but Michael had learned to channel it into perfectionism. He was valedictorian of his high school class, captain of the debate team, the kind of student that teachers pointed to as an example for others. Sarah came from a different world entirely. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a waitress, and they'd raised her to believe that happiness mattered more than grades. She was smart enough to earn a partial scholarship to Northwestern, but she wore her intelligence lightly, never making others feel inferior for knowing less. When they were assigned as lab partners in Chemistry 101, something clicked. Michael helped Sarah with the technical aspects of their experiments, while Sarah helped Michael learn to relax, to find joy in the process rather than just the results. For the first time in his life, Michael felt like he could be himself around someone without constantly worrying about meeting expectations. Their friendship deepened over late-night study sessions, weekend movies, and countless conversations about their dreams for the future. Sarah wanted to become a veterinarian, driven by a love for animals that had defined her since childhood. Michael was pre-med, following a path his parents had mapped out for him since he was 12 years old. But as their sophomore year progressed, something began to change in Michael. Something dark and possessive that would ultimately destroy everything they'd built together. The seeds of jealousy had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. Perfect life. Sarah's life seemed to unfold effortlessly in ways that made Michael's carefully controlled existence feel hollow by comparison. While he struggled to maintain his perfect GPA through endless hours of studying, Sarah managed to excel academically while also having a rich social life that seemed to expand every week. She joined the campus environmental club and quickly became its president. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, coming back with stories about the dogs and cats she'd helped find homes. She dated casually, never getting too serious with anyone, but always seeming to have fun, interesting people in her orbit. Michael watched it all with a mixture of admiration and growing resentment. How could she make everything look so easy? How could she be successful without sacrificing every moment of happiness the way he did? The breaking point came during their junior year when Sarah was accepted into the university's prestigious veterinary program, a program that Michael had secretly applied to as well, thinking he might switch from pre-med to follow a path that actually interested him rather than just pleased his parents. Sarah's acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday. Michael's rejection letter came the following Friday. "I can't believe it," Sarah had said, bursting into their usual study spot in the library with the letter in her hand. "I got in. I actually got in." Michael forced himself to smile, to congratulate her, to act like the supportive friend he'd always been. But inside, something was breaking apart. Sarah had gotten the thing he wanted without even seeming to try very hard. She'd beaten him at something he'd convinced himself he was better at. That night, alone in his dorm room, Michael stared at his rejection letter and felt a rage unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't fair. He worked harder than anyone he knew. He deserved success more than people who treated life like a game. He deserved it more than Sarah. The thought scared him with its intensity, but once it took root, it began to grow. Michael started paying closer attention to Sarah's life, cataloging every success, every moment of happiness, every advantage she seemed to have that he didn't. She came from a loving family that supported her choices unconditionally. His parents called every week to ask about his grades and remind him of their sacrifices. She had natural charisma that drew people to her. He had to work for every friendship, every connection. She seemed to move through the world with an ease that he could never achieve. The jealousy consumed him slowly, like a poison that he couldn't stop taking. The mask slips. By senior year, Michael had become expert at hiding his growing resentment behind the facade of their friendship. He still helped Sarah with her studies. He still listened to her talk about her plans for veterinary school, still acted like the supportive friend he'd always been. But privately, he began to fantasize about scenarios where Sarah's perfect life would come crashing down. He imagined her failing her classes, being rejected from graduate programs, experiencing the kind of disappointment that had become so familiar to him. He began to imagine more permanent solutions to the problem of Sarah's success. Though he told himself these were just thoughts, just ways of releasing the pressure that built up inside him when he watched her effortless achievements. Sarah, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the change in her best friend. Michael was still the person she turned to when she needed help with difficult coursework, still the one she called when she was stressed about exams or applications. She trusted him completely, never suspecting that behind his helpful exterior lay a mind that was slowly unraveling. The first crack in Michael's mask appeared during spring break of their senior year. Sarah had been accepted to 3 different veterinary schools and was agonizing over which one to choose. She'd asked Michael to help her make a pros and cons list, the way they'd done for so many decisions over the years. "I'm so lucky," she said, as they sat in her apartment, acceptance letters spread across the coffee table. "I never imagined I'd have this many options." "Lucky," Michael repeated, and something in his tone made Sarah look up from the letters. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," Michael said quickly. "I just think luck has less to do with it than you think." Sarah studied his face, sensing an undercurrent she didn't understand. "Are you okay? You've seemed different lately." Michael forced himself to smile. "I'm fine. Just stressed about graduation, you know?" But Sarah's question stayed with him. Was he becoming that obvious? Was his carefully maintained facade starting to slip? He realized he needed to be more careful. He also realized that his fantasies about Sarah's downfall were no longer enough to satisfy the rage that burned inside him. He needed something more permanent, more final. He needed Sarah to disappear from his life forever. The plan. The idea came to him during finals week, when the stress of maintaining his perfect academic record while battling his internal demons had pushed him to a breaking point. Sarah had just received notification that she'd been awarded a full scholarship to her first-choice veterinary school. While Michael was facing the prospect of massive student loans for medical school, if he even got accepted anywhere, it wasn't fair. It had never been fair. And Michael was tired of pretending that it was. He began to plan with the same methodical attention to detail that he brought to everything else in his life. Sarah trusted him completely, which meant she would go anywhere with him, believe any story he told her. She was also predictable in her habits, which made it easy to find opportunities when they would be alone together. The plan he developed was simple. Invite Sarah on a hiking trip to celebrate their upcoming graduation. There was a trail he knew about an hour outside the city, remote enough that they wouldn't encounter other hikers. He would tell her he wanted to have a serious conversation about their friendship, about how much she meant to him before they went their separate ways after graduation. Sarah would come because she was a good friend, because she cared about him, because she had no reason to suspect that the person she trusted most in the world was planning to kill her. Michael spent weeks refining the details. He researched the trail, identifying the perfect spot where he could dispose of her body, where it would never be found. He practiced his story until it sounded natural, spontaneous. He even bought the supplies he would need, telling himself he was just being thorough, just making sure nothing could go wrong. The hardest part was maintaining normal behavior around Sarah during those final weeks of planning. She was so excited about graduation, about veterinary school, about the future she thought she was going to have. She talked constantly about her plans, her dreams, her gratitude for having a friend like Michael who had supported her through everything. Each conversation felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Sarah's happiness, her trust, her complete obliviousness to what was coming, it all fed the rage that had been building inside him for years. On the night before their planned hiking trip, Sarah called to thank him for organizing it. "You're such a good friend," she said. "I know we probably drift apart after graduation. Everyone says that happens, but I want you to know that these 4 years with you have been the best of my life." Michael hung up the phone and stared at the hiking supplies he'd laid out in his room. Tomorrow, Sarah Williams would cease to exist, and he would finally be free of the jealousy that had been eating him alive. He felt no guilt, no second thoughts, only a cold satisfaction that justice was finally going to be served. The last day, Saturday morning, dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for hiking. Michael picked up Sarah at her apartment at 8 a.m., just as they'd planned. She was in a great mood, chattering about graduation next week and her plans for the summer before veterinary school started. "I can't believe we're really graduating," she said, as they drove toward the mountains. "Remember how scared we were freshman year? You were convinced you were going to fail chemistry." Michael smiled and made appropriate responses, but his mind was focused on what lay ahead. He'd gone over the plan so many times that it felt like muscle memory now. Drive to the trailhead, hike to the remote spot he'd scouted. Wait for the right moment. Act. The trail was exactly as deserted as he'd hoped. They hiked for about an hour, Sarah pointing out wildflowers and birds, Michael carrying the backpack that contained everything he would need. When they reached the spot, he'd chosen a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. Miles from the nearest road, he suggested they stop for lunch. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, sitting on a fallen log and pulling out the sandwiches she'd packed. "I'm going to miss this when I move to Colorado for school." "Are you nervous?" Michael asked, settling beside her. "About starting over somewhere new?" "Michael," a little, Sarah admitted, but mostly excited. "It feels like my whole life is just beginning, you know?" Michael nodded, though inside he was thinking that her life was actually about to end. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the rope he'd brought, keeping it hidden behind his body. Sarah's voice had changed, become uncertain. "What are you doing?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment the magnitude of what he was about to do hit him. This was Sarah, his best friend for 4 years, the person who had helped him through his darkest moments in college. She was looking at him with confusion and the first hint of fear, still not quite believing that he could mean her harm. The moment of doubt passed. "I'm sorry," he said, and he almost meant it. "But this is how it has to be." The murder, what happened next, was brutal and quick. Sarah tried to run when she realized Michael's intentions, but he was stronger and had the advantage of planning. She fought back with desperate courage, scratching his face and screaming for help that would never come. Michael had imagined this moment many times, but the reality was messier, more violent, more personal than his fantasies had prepared him for. Sarah's terror was real. Her pleas for mercy were real. Her final moments were nothing like the clean, simple ending he'd envisioned. When it was over, Michael sat beside her body for nearly an hour, trying to process what he'd done. He felt no satisfaction, no relief from the jealousy that had driven him to this point. If anything, the rage inside him felt stronger than ever, because even in death, Sarah had taken something from him, his image of himself as a good person. But it was too late for regrets. Michael had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now his only choice was to cover his tracks and try to build a life on the foundation of this terrible secret. He buried Sarah's body in a spot he'd prepared weeks earlier, deep in the forest where hikers never went. He scattered rocks and branches over the grave, making it look like natural forest floor. He cleaned up every trace of their presence in the clearing, packed out everything they'd brought. By the time he drove back to campus that evening, Michael had his story ready. Sarah had decided at the last minute not to go hiking. She'd said she had too much to do before graduation. He'd gone alone and had a nice, peaceful day in the mountains. It was a simple lie, and it worked perfectly. The investigation: Sarah was reported missing on Sunday evening when she failed to show up for a study group she deorganized. Her roommate called campus security, then the police, when Sarah didn't answer her phone or return to their apartment. The initial investigation focused on the possibility that Sarah had simply decided to take a spontaneous trip before graduation. She was known to be impulsive, and the stress of final exams and upcoming life changes could have prompted her to need some space. But as hours turned into days with no contact, the investigation became more serious. Police interviewed Sarah's friends, family, and professors, looking for any clue about where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. Michael was questioned early in the process, as Sarah's closest friend and one of the last people to see her. He told investigators about their planned hiking trip and how Sarah had canceled at the last minute. He seemed genuinely concerned about her disappearance, offering to help with the search in any way he could. The police found no evidence of foul play in Sarah's apartment. Her car was still in the parking lot, but she could have gotten a ride with someone. Her bank accounts and credit cards showed no activity, but she had enough cash to survive for several days. As the investigation continued, Michael inserted himself into the search efforts. Joining volunteer groups that combed the campus and surrounding areas, he attended vigils for Sarah, comforted her grieving parents when they came to town, and maintained the facade of a worried friend desperate for answers. The performance was exhausting, but Michael had become expert at hiding his true feelings behind a mask of appropriate emotions. He grieved publicly for his missing friend, while privately celebrating his freedom from the jealousy that had consumed him. Weeks passed without any trace of Sarah. The case remained open, but with no leads and no evidence of a crime, it gradually faded from active investigation. Sarah's parents hired a private investigator, but even he found nothing. Michael graduated with honors and was accepted to medical school. He moved to a different state, started a new life, and tried to convince himself that he'd successfully gotten away with murder. But Sarah's disappearance had created ripples that would eventually lead back to him. The unraveling for 3 years, Michael lived with his secret. He excelled in medical school, just as he'd excelled in everything else. He made new friends, dated occasionally, and built what appeared to be a normal, successful life. But the guilt and paranoia aided him constantly. He jumped every time his phone rang unexpectedly. He avoided news stories about missing persons cases. He changed his appearance, moving from contact lenses to glasses, growing a beard, anything to distance himself from the person he'd been in college. The breakthrough in Sarah's case came from an unexpected source: climate change. A severe drought in the region where Michael had buried her body lowered the water table enough to expose part of her remains to a hiker dog in the summer of his 3rd year of medical school. The discovery of Sarah's body transformed her disappearance from a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. Forensic analysis revealed that she'd been strangled, and the remote location of her burial site suggested that her killer had planned the murder carefully. Police reopened their investigation with new urgency, re-interviewing everyone who had known Sarah. Michael's story about their canceled hiking trip suddenly seemed more significant. Why would Sarah have canceled a trip she'd been looking forward to? And why had Michael gone alone to such a remote location? Investigators began to dig deeper into Michael's background and his relationship with Sarah. They discovered his rejection from the veterinary program that Sarah had been accepted to. They found evidence of his increasing social isolation during senior year. They talked to classmates who remembered subtle changes in his behavior around Sarah. The case against Michael was largely circumstantial, but it was compelling. He had motive, opportunity, and had lied to police about his last contact with Sarah. When confronted with the evidence, his carefully maintained facade finally cracked. Michael confessed to Sarah's murder during a 12-hour interrogation, providing details that only the killer could have known. He showed no remorse, describing the crime as something that had been necessary, inevitable. "She had everything," he told investigators. "Everything should have been mine." The trial and aftermath. Michael's trial was a sensation on the Northwestern campus and in the broader community. The idea that a brilliant pre-med student could murder his best friend out of jealousy challenged everyone's assumptions about the nature of evil. The prosecution painted a picture of a young man whose perfectionism and entitlement had twisted into something monstrous. They presented evidence of Michael's careful planning, his lies to police, and his complete lack of remorse for destroying a life full of promise. The defense argued that Michael had suffered a psychological break brought on by academic pressure and family expectations. They presented expert testimony about the effects of chronic stress on developing minds, suggesting that Michael's crime was the result of mental illness rather than pure evil. But the jury saw through the attempts to excuse Michael's actions. After deliberating for just 6 hours, they found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah's parents attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row and staring at the young man who had taken their daughter from them. In their victim impact statements, they spoke not about revenge, but about the future. Sarah would never have the animals she would never heal, family she would never raise, the joy she would never bring to the world. Michael showed no emotion during their statements, just as he had shown no emotion throughout the trial. Even facing life in prison, he seemed to feel that he was the victim of an unfair system that had failed to recognize his superiority. He was transferred to a maximum security prison where he would spend the rest of his life. His parents, devastated by their son's crimes, moved away, and changed their names. His former classmates struggled to reconcile the helpful, studious young man they'd known with the cold-blooded killer he'd revealed himself to be. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked jealousy and entitlement. Sarah's memory was honored with a scholarship fund that helped students from working-class families pursue veterinary medicine, the dream that Michael-esque jealousy had destroyed along with her life. Michael Chen had been Sarah Williams' best friend in college, until the day he decided that her success was more than he could bear. In choosing murder over accepting that someone else might deserve good things, he destroyed not only Sarah's life but his own. The tragedy serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones capable of the greatest betrayal. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.